Immigration to Brazil is the movement to Brazil of foreign persons to reside permanently. It should not be confused with the colonization of the country by the Portuguese, or with the forcible bringing of people from Africa as slaves. Throughout its history, Brazil has always been a recipient of immigrants, but this began to gain importance in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century when the country received massive immigration from Europe, the Middle East and the Far East, which left lasting marks on demography, culture, language and the economy of Brazil. In general, it is considered that people who entered Brazil until 1822, the year of independence, were colonizers. Since then, those who entered the independent nation were immigrants. Before 1871, the number of immigrants rarely exceeded 2,000 or 3,000 people a year. Immigration increased pressure from the first end of the international slave trade to Brazil, after the expansion of the economy, especially in the period of large coffee plantations in the state of São Paulo. Immigration has been a very important demographic factor in the composition, structure and history of human population in Brazil, with all its attending factors and consequences in culture, economy, education, racial issues, etc. Brazil has received one of the largest numbers of immigrants in the Western Hemisphere, along with the United States, Argentina and Canada. Counting from 1872, by the year 2000, Brazil received about 6 million immigrants. Brief history. Maria Stella Ferreira Levy suggests the following periodization of the process of immigration to Brazil. 1. 1820 to 1876, small number of immigrants, predominance of Portuguese, with significant numbers of Germans. 2. 1877 to 1903, large number of immigrants, predominance of Italians. 3. 1904 to 1930, large number of immigrants, predominance of the Portuguese. 4. 1931 to 1963, declining number of immigrants, predominance of the Portuguese. The Brazilian population before immigration, when Brazil was discovered as a new land in the New World by the Portuguese in 1500. Its native population was composed of about 2.4 million Amerindians whose ancestors had been living there for the last 15,000 to 20,000 years. During the 3 decades afterwards, the country remained sparsely inhabited by Europeans. Among those few, mainly Portuguese, most were renegades, criminals banished from Portugal, shipwreck survivors, or mutinous sailors. They integrated into the local tribes, using the superior technology to attain privileged positions among them. After 1530, the Portuguese started to settle in Brazil in significant numbers. However, Portugal had a small population to develop the exploitation of Brazil. By 1550, the colonists started to bring African slaves. From 1500, when the Portuguese reached Brazil, until its independence in 1822, from 500,000 to 700,000 Portuguese settled in Brazil, 600,000 of whom arrived in the 18th century alone. The Portuguese settled in the whole territory, initially remaining near the coast, except in the region of São Paulo, from where the bandeirantes would spread into the hinterland. In the 18th century, large waves of Portuguese settled the country, in the wake of the discovery of gold in the region of Minas Gerais. But the number of Portuguese who settled in Brazil in its colonial era was far lower than of African slaves. From 1550 to 1850, some 4 million slaves were brought to Brazil. This should not be taken as meaning that the population of Brazil before independence was mainly black. The average survival of an African slave in Brazil was of merely 7 years after arrival, implying extremely high mortality rates. Although children born to slave women inherited the slave condition, the Portuguese always relied on slaves purchased from slave traders to replace and increase the workforce. The natural growth of the slave population was always very small. In the early 19th century, Brazil was mainly composed of people of 3 different origins: the indigenous inhabitants, the Portuguese and the descendants, the Africans and descendants, and, naturally, people of varying degrees of racial mixture. In 1872, after the arrival of about 350,000 mostly European immigrants and about 1,150,000 Africans forcibly brought to Brazil as slaves, the first Brazilian census counted 9,930,478 people in Brazil, of which 3,787,289 whites, 3,380,172 pardos, 1.954.452 blacks, and 386,955 caboclos. First period. Immigration properly started with the opening of the Brazilian ports. In 1808, the government began to stimulate the arrival of Europeans to occupy plots of land and become small farmers. In 1812, settlers from the Azores were brought to Espiritu Santo, and in 1819, Swiss to Nova Friburgard, Rio de Janeiro. After independence from Portugal, the Brazilian Empire focused on the occupation of the provinces of southern Brazil. It was mainly because southern Brazil had a small population, vulnerable to attacks by Argentina and the Kaingang Indians. From 1824, immigrants from Central Europe started to populate what is nowadays the region of São Leopoldo, in the province of Rio Grande do Sul. According to Leo Weibel, these German immigrants were mainly oppressed peasants and former soldiers of the army of Napoleon. Quote, in 1830 a bill was passed forbidding the imperial government from spending money with the settlement of immigrants, which stalled immigration until 1834, when the provincial governments were charged with promoting immigration. In 1859, Prussia prohibited emigration to Brazil. This was mainly because of complaints that Germans were being exploited in the coffee plantations of São Paulo. Still, between 1820 and 1876, 350,117 immigrants entered Brazil. Of these, 45.73% were Portuguese, 35.74% of other nationalities, 12.97% Germans, while Italians and Spanish together did not reach 6%. The total number of immigrants per year averaged 6,000. Many immigrants, particularly the Germans, were brought to settle in rural communities as small landowners. They received land, seed, livestock and other items to develop. Second period. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the entry of immigrants in Brazil grew strongly. On one hand, Europe underwent a serious demographic crisis, which resulted in increased emigration. On the other hand, the final crisis of Brazilian slavery prompted Brazilian authorities to find solutions for the problem of workforce. Consequently, while immigration until 1876 was focused on establishing communities of landowners, during this period, while this older process continued, immigrants were more and more attracted to the coffee plantations of São Paulo, where they became employees or were allowed to cultivate small tracts of land in exchange for the work in the coffee crop. This also coincided with the decreasing availability of better land in southern Brazil, while the German immigrants arriving in the previous period occupied the valleys of the rivers. The Italians, arriving in the last quarter of the century, settled the mountainous regions of the state. During this period, immigration was much more intense. Large numbers of Europeans, especially Italians, started to be brought to the country to work in the harvest of coffee. From 1877 to 1903, almost 2 million immigrants arrived, at a rate of 71,000 per year. Brazil's receiving structure, legislation and settlement policies for immigrants were much less organized than in Canada and the United States at the time. Nevertheless, an immigrants' hostel was built in 1886 in São Paulo, and quick admittance and recording routines for the throngs of immigrants arriving by ship at the seaports of Vitória, Rio de Janeiro, Santos, Paranagua, Florianopolis and Porto Alegre were established. The São Paulo site alone processed more than 2.5 million immigrants in its almost 100 years of continuous operation. People of more than 70 different nationalities were recorded. In 1850, Brazil declared the end of the slave trade. This had different impacts on the different regions of Brazil. At the time, the region of São Paulo was undergoing a process of economic boom linked to the expansion of the cultivation of coffee, and consequently needed increased amounts of labor. Other regions, notably the Northeast, on the contrary, faced economic retraction, and were, consequently, able to dispense workforce. This entailed the replacement of the international slave trade by an internal or interprovincial slave trade, in which northeastern slaves were sold in large numbers to the southeast. This temporarily solved the workforce problem in São Paulo and other coffee plantation areas. However, by 1870 the Paulista elite came to realize that the northeastern slaveholders were in fact being able to obtain financial compensation for their slaves, or, in practice, an abolition with compensation. Fears of a situation comparable to the United States, with the division of the country into free provinces and slave provinces, arose. Consequently, Paulista politicians began to seek measures against the interprovincial traffic, at a time when, anyway, the price of northeastern slaves was getting higher and higher, due to their increasing scarcity. By the beginning of the 1870s, the alternative of the interprovincial trade was exhausted, while the demand for workforce in the coffee plantations continued to expand. Thus the Paulista oligarchy sought to attract new workers from abroad, by passing provincial legislation and pressing the imperial government to organize immigration. Third period, 1904 to 1930. From 1904 to 1930, 2,142,781 immigrants came to Brazil, making an annual average of 79,000 people. In consequence of the Permanently decree of 1902 that forbade subsidized emigration to Brazil, Italian immigration had, at this stage, a drastic reduction. Their average annual entries from 1887 to 1903 was 58,000. In this period they were only 19,000 annually. The Portuguese constituted 38% of entries, followed by Spaniards with 22%. From 1914 to 1918, due to World War I, the entry of immigrants of all nationalities decreased. After the war, the immigration of people of other nationalities regressed faster than that of Portuguese, Spaniards, and Italians. Part of this category was composed of immigrants from Poland, Russia and Romania who immigrated probably by political issues, and part by Syrian and Lebanese peoples. Both subgroups included a number of Jewish immigrants who arrived in the 1920s. From 1931 to 1963, 1,106,404 immigrants entered Brazil. The participation of the Japanese increased. From 1932 to 1935, immigrants from Japan constituted 30% of total admissions. Prior to this, yearly Japanese immigrants were numerically limited to no more than 5% of the current Japanese population. Fourth period. With the radicalization of the political situation in Europe, the end of the demographic crisis, the decadence of coffee culture, the revolution of 1930 and the consequent rise of a nationalist government, immigration to Brazil was significantly reduced. The focus shifted to culturally assimilating immigrants and whitening the population. From 1931 to 1963, 1,106,404 immigrants entered Brazil. The annual arrival of immigrants fell to 33,500. The Portuguese remained the most significant group with 39.35%. The participation of the Japanese increased, becoming the second most important group with 12.79%. Particularly from 1932 to 1935, immigrants from Japan constituted 30% of total admissions. Immigration also became a more urban phenomenon. Most immigrants came for the cities, and even the descendants of the immigrants of the previous periods were moving intensely from the countryside. In the 1950s, Brazil started a program of immigration to provide workers for Brazilian industries. In São Paulo, for example, between 1957 and 1961, more than 30% of the Spanish, over 50% of the Italian and 70% of the Greek immigrants were brought to work in factories. Current trends. During the 1970s, Brazil received about 32,000 Lebanese immigrants escaping the civil war, as well as smaller numbers of Palestinians and Syrians. During the 1990s, Brazil received small numbers of immigrants from the former republics of Yugoslavia, from Afghanistan and West Africa. Recent immigration is mainly constituted by Chinese and Koreans and, in a smaller degree, by Argentines and other Latin American immigrants. The increase in Bolivian immigrants in Brazil is one of the social consequences of the political crisis affecting that country. The majority of the Bolivians come from cities such as La Paz, Sucre, Santa Cruz de la Sierra, and Cochabamba. Usually they enter Brazil through Cuiabá in Mato Grosso, or San Matthias in Bolivia, which borders Cáceres, Mato Grosso and Coimbra, in Mato Grosso do Sul. Between 1,200 and 1,500 Bolivian immigrants come to Brazil every month looking for a job. Most of them work in the illegal textile industry in the Greater São Paulo. There are an estimated 200,000 Bolivians living in the Greater São Paulo. Majority is of undocumented immigrants. In 2009, the country was home to 3,982,000 foreign-born people. That represents 2.36% of the Brazilian population. The major work visas concessions were granted for citizens of the United States and the United Kingdom. In 2010, Brazil is home to 4,251 refugees from 76 different nationalities. The largest refugee ancestries were Angolan, Colombian, Congolese, Liberian and Iraqi. Visa policy. Permanent visas may be granted to individuals intending to establish residence in Brazil. Permanent visas apply to technicians or professionals with a work contract pre-approved by the Brazilian Ministry of Labor, National Department of Employment. This visa must be applied for in Brazil. Professors, technicians and high-level researchers who wish to immigrate to Brazil to undertake research work in an institution of higher learning or of research in science and technology. This visa must be applied for in Brazil. Foreign investors with initial transfer of foreign capital equivalent to no less than $50,000 and an investment plan pre-approved by the Brazilian National Council on Immigration. This visa must be applied for in Brazil. Administrators, managers or directors hired by commercial enterprise or civil organization resulting from foreign investment described in Item 3 above, with a work contract pre-approved by the Brazilian Ministry of Labor, National Department of Employment. This visa must be applied for in Brazil. A retired person, 60 years of age or older, accompanied by up to 2 dependents, and able to transfer monthly, in accordance with the laws of the country of origin, the amount equivalent to $2,000. In the case of more than 2 dependents, the applicant must transfer the amount equivalent to $1,000 for each additional dependent. Spouse, partners in a common law union regardless of gender, or minor dependent of Brazilian citizen or of a permanent resident of Brazil, ancestors of a Brazilian national or of a permanent resident of Brazil, siblings of a Brazilian citizen or of a permanent resident of Brazil, if orphan, single and under 18 years of age, minor children, her children or great-her children of a Brazilian citizen or of a permanent resident of Brazil. Binational unions, formed by a Brazilian and other people from other country. Immigration law. Federal Constitution Article 12. The following are Brazilians. 2. Naturalize. A. Those who, as set forth by law, acquire Brazilian nationality, it being the only requirement for persons originating from Portuguese-speaking countries the residence for 1 uninterrupted year and good moral repute. B. Foreigners of any nationality, resident in the Federative Republic of Brazil for over 15 uninterrupted years and without criminal conviction, provided that they apply for the Brazilian nationality. Paragraph 1. The rights inherent to Brazilians shall be attributed to Portuguese citizens with permanent residence in Brazil, if there is reciprocity in favor of Brazilians, except in the cases stated in this Constitution. Paragraph 2. The law may not establish any distinction between born and naturalized Brazilians, except in the cases stated in this Constitution. Statute of Foreigner Article 112. The conditions for the granting of naturalization: I. Civilian capacity, according to Brazilian law. 2. To be registered as permanent resident in Brazil. 3. Continuous residence in the territory for a minimum period of 4 years immediately preceding the application for naturalization. IV. Read and write the Portuguese language, considering the conditions of naturalizing. V. Exercise of occupation, possession of sufficient assets to maintain itself and the family. Vi. Proper procedure. 7. No complaint, indictment in Brazil or abroad for a felony that is threatened in minimum sentence of imprisonment, abstractly considered, more than 1 year. 8. Good health. Article 113. The period of residence prescribed in Article 112, Item 3, may be reduced if the naturalizing fill any of the following conditions. I. Have a child as spouse of Brazil. 2. Be son of a Brazilian. 3. Have provided or can provide relevant services to Brazil, in the opinion of the Minister of Justice of Brazil. IV. Commend themselves by the professional, scientific or artistic, or V. To be owner in Brazil, real estate, whose value is equal to at least 1,000 times the greatest value of reference, or be provided with industrial funds of equal value, or hold quota shares or amount of paid-in least identical in commercial or civil society, aimed principally and permanently, the operation of industrial or agricultural activities. Sole paragraph. The residence will be at least 1 year in cases of items I, 2, and 3, 2 years in item IV, and 3 years in item V. Amnesty. Since the 1980s, the Brazilian government has offered amnesty to foreigners in irregular situation in 4 different campaigns, benefiting tens of thousands of foreigners living in Brazil. The latest campaign began in July 2009 by presidential decree, and though it officially ended at the close of 2009, some cases are still pending. Until now, 41,816 foreigners received amnesty through the 2009 Amnesty program, though there are another 2,000 cases expected to be finished in early 2010. Though the large majority of immigrants live in São Paulo, other cases were based largely in Rio de Janeiro and Paraná. The breakdown by country, continent is the following: 16,881 Bolivians, 5,492 Chinese, 4,642 Peruvians, 4,135 Paraguayans, 2,700 Africans, 2,390 Europeans, 1,129 Koreans, 469 Argentines, 274 U.S. citizens, 186 Cubans, while foreigners who received amnesty obtained the right to work and access health and education services. They are unable to vote or run for public office. They may opt to apply for citizenship after a probation period of residency in order to obtain these rights. Officially, amnesty intends to cut down on illegal activity and human rights violations, particularly with Bolivians in São Paulo, but it seems to fit in with the Lula administration's international policies, including ramped-up diplomacy and establishing ties with other nations, but also establishing itself as a competitor with developed countries, by showing that it is a center for immigrants in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in South America, and more importantly, that it is supposedly a benevolent and welcoming country for immigrants. It helps Brazil's international public image. Those who would benefit from the amnesty, following publication of the law in the Brazilian Official Gazette in July 2009, have up to 180 days after the time of the temporary residence permit to apply. They must also avert a clean criminal record or submit a recent official document of good conduct from the originating country. During these 2 years, they must not exceed 90 consecutive days spent abroad, 90 days prior to the expiration of the temporary residence permit. They must avert the self-sufficiency in Brazil. If they can prove they are eligible for a permanent residence permit, only 10 years after receiving a permanent residence permit may be eligible for naturalization to be Brazilian.